not only civil society and youth-led organizations that are sort of asking and sort of pushing for the youth forum to actually turn into a meaningful mechanisms. I think we see from the behavior of a lot of country delegations that have actively worked in the last couple of years to integrate the delegates that they sent to the youth forum in their actual delegation and bring them to the negotiation table and make them attend meetings at the CND and be really involved with side events and other activities happening at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. I think we see through that behavior that a lot of the countries sort of see the necessity of transforming that space into something meaningful.
Prevention is a huge aspect of the UN drugs like policy. Like there's a whole area of it. It's all about prevention, and prevention covers like, you know, anything that would be like drug education, anything that involves getting like stopping the drug supply and all this sort of thing. But it's, you know, anything to stop people using drugs is prevention. But traditionally, there's been no kind of policy that says that has to be evidence-based. So this was a policy brought forward by the European Union that Slovenia brought forward, Slovenia and France together brought forward on behalf of the European Union. And that was all about, okay, this has to be backed by data. If people are going to do this, we don't want them just like doing just say no, like don't just telling people, you know, doing their DARE programs that have no evidence to back it up. We're going to say we want it backed up by evidence. And that resolution went through.
Welcome everyone to the Sensible Drug Policy Show, created by Students for Sensible Drug Policy International. Here, we share insights from young advocates at the forefront of local, national, and international decision-making around drugs. Our network is an active force for reform in more than 30 countries around the world, and it's time you hear them talk. You will hear from policy experts, both current students and alumni, who will share their experience, tips, and insider knowledge about the most recent developments in the field.
When you say you wanted to clarify the purpose of the Youth Forum, you actually met with someone from UNODC and asked them directly at the meeting, how do you justify the lack of youth engagement coming from the Youth Forum and the fact that you have all these like a bunch of parallel organizations like ours who are just, you know, bringing that discussion to the House, but not through the official ways.
Yeah, when I spoke to UNODC, I didn't come out with much more understanding than I went in, which isn't surprising. UN agencies can be very tricky. But when I met with them, you know, I asked like, what's the purpose? And they're like, oh, you know, to bring young people together to talk about drugs. And I was like, okay, this sounds like something you wouldn't have to do at the commission. You know, like that sounds like something you could definitely do any other day except for the most busy week that the UNODC experiences. And he was like, yeah, well, they get to make a statement. And I was like, cool. But yeah, so is the purpose that they get to influence the proceedings by being allowed to intervene, but they're not allowed to intervene, sorry, by being allowed to make a statement. They're only allowed to make one statement. They don't follow proceedings. They don't get to engage in any other manner. And he was like, I don't know. And like, I was suggesting it would be great if the Youth Forum representatives were allowed to follow the proceedings of the commission and advise their country representatives from the youth perspective. Like, to me, that's what that forum should work like, you know, should function.
So it should be the youth member of the country delegation should go there at the Youth Forum. Yeah. So it would be like the youth CND basically.
Yeah, and that, you know, these people would be able to give like, you know, solid advice to their country representatives when they're going to talk about resolutions that might affect youth, that, you know, these people are informed, that they know what's happening, that they're allowed to engage. You know, currently as civil society, we're allowed to engage more than Youth Forum members are, which is bizarre. You know, this is something organized by the UNODC, like by the UN itself has like made this little Youth Forum and then said, oh, actually, no, you're not allowed to play, you're not allowed to be part of this. And like civil society is bottom of the barrel, like, to be clear, like,
yeah,
to only engage at like the minimum level. And like youth forum way below that. They're, you know, not allowed to observe. Well, I'm not sure if they're allowed to observe, and I haven't, it's unclear. And
what you're describing really does sound like tokenism. So I'm aware of the time, and I want to start wrapping up with two important highlights of this year's CND. So CND 2022. And so I'm hearing that there was some good youth language in one of the resolutions presented by the EU. What is the topic about that?
Well, this resolution was on early prevention, which in English means, you know, trying to prevent young people using drugs. Which is not really, like, just say no is not my attitude, but actually this resolution was quite good. Like, the way the resolution is set up is that prevention's a huge aspect of the UN drugs like policy. Like, there's a whole area of it. It's all about prevention, and prevention covers, like, you know, anything that would be like drug education, anything that involves getting, like, stopping the drug supply and all this sort of thing. But it's, you know, anything to stop people using drugs is prevention. But traditionally, there's been no kind of policy that says that has to be evidence-based. So this was a policy brought forward by the European Union that Slovenia brought forward, Slovenia and France together brought forward on behalf of the European Union. And that was all about, okay, this has to be backed by data. If people are going to do this, we don't want them just like doing just say no, like don't just telling people, you know, doing their DARE programs that have no evidence to back it up. We're going to say we want it backed up by evidence. And that resolution went through, and, you know, the resolutions go through loads of like conversations about what language should go into the final document. And that's what the CND mostly is, just, you know, countries giving out to each other about different like pernickety wording things. But what we got into it, which we're really, really happy, is that the Australian delegation fought really, really hard for young people and youth-based organizations. This is the term that was included in to be included on a paragraph about where they would have a multi-stakeholder task force, I believe the term was, to address like this data backed evidence, this evidence-backed early prevention. Now, youth-based, not my favorite term, but it's the UN, so we're going, you know, we're going for anything we can get. And it's really, really rare that you see this really specifically stated out, because when it's, you know, they might say, oh, you have to consult civil society, or oh, you have to, you know, do multi-stakeholder engagement. But when it's really specifically laid out, like where you have youth, young people and youth-based organizations, that's where we can come in and be like, hey, you know, this is your resolution, you know, you said you were going to do this. Tell me how you did it, or let me do it with you. I can help you do that. So that's like what we really like to see in it. And also just in general, just seeing that like young people being involved, not only in like not only as like the kind of people who are being affected by the policy, but also in the design and implementation. Because we don't look just at the policy element, but we also want to make sure that young people are involved throughout, you know, in the design of the project and the implementation side of it as well, especially. So I think that was the really nice language that came through. It wasn't perfect because youth-based can mean whatever the hell they want it to mean. But, you know, we would have rather youth-led. Youth-based means it just has to be kind of loosely based and doesn't have a real definition, but it's better than nothing. I'm glad it's there.
Thanks, Róisín. So this it sounds like it's an important kind of language that later on is going to turn into something concrete for youth engagement.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And then Iulia, you wanted to add something about the youth forum?
Yes, I think, you know, Róisín rightfully pointed out how, you know, it is unclear what the UN officials really want to do with the youth forum. And I think a lot of the delegates are really limited in terms of what they can do and how much they are exposed to the Commission of Narcotic Drugs. But I think it's important to stress that it's not only civil society and youth-led organizations that are sort of asking and sort of pushing for the youth forum to actually turn into a meaningful mechanisms. I think we see from the behavior of a lot of country delegations that have actively worked in the last couple of years to integrate the delegates that they sent to the youth forum in their actual delegation and bring them to the negotiation table and make them attend meetings at the CND and be really involved with side events and other activities happening at the Commission of Narcotic Drugs. I think we see through that behavior that a lot of the countries sort of see the necessity of transforming that space into something meaningful. And I think that's really, really important to stress. And what we've seen with UNODC is that they usually try to very much influence the agenda of what is discussed in the youth forum, and we've seen a lot of youth delegates that we managed to talk to that said that, oh, we wanted to bring this issue and sort of like change the focus of our statement towards this, but we weren't allowed to, or they said, oh no, this is the kind of direction that we want to pursue, this is the kind of message that we want to convey with the youth forum, so you can't bring this issue into the topic, which constitutes a major problem, because it sort of shows that it's very much a conduit for the UNODC to really double down on their messages rather than give a meaningful space for young people to influence policy and have their voices heard. Although I hope that what we're going to see, given that more country delegations are sending people to the youth forum, but they're also involving them as active members in the CND negotiations. I do hope we see the UNODC kind of trying to change their mindset and sort of realize that it comes from both sides, both a civil society, and I think country delegations are looking to transform that space into something that is meaningful and something that can actually bring young people to the forefront of policy making.
So what you're saying is really important about the UNODC, or the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, that organizes the Commission on Narcotic Drugs every year. I think it's what you said about the agenda settings, because there's such a thing in politics or in the decision-making process as agenda setting power. So whoever gets to set the agenda, it actually has a unprecedented or incomparable power to any other members of the decision-making process, of any other stakeholder, because they get to set the topic that will be discussed, right? And they get to not set the topic that they don't want to be discussed, and that there lays a very real power. And I've heard that generally, kind of, it's a known fact that Russia has had a very kind of strong hold on the Office of Drugs and Crime traditionally. So I want to know how, what's your take on that, and specifically how did the kind of the current situation and the war in Ukraine make an impact on this year's CND?
Russia, alongside the US, has been one of the major players at the Commission. Russia's heavily one of the biggest funders of drug prevention in the world. They also fund things like the Youth Forum as well, which is
okay.
Yeah. And if you want something really funny about the Youth Forum, it's funded by Russia and the Order of Malta. So, which why. I could hazard a guess, but yeah. So obviously, all international proceedings have been affected by the war in Ukraine, and the Commission was no exception to this. It was really, really quite dramatic. There was multiple walkouts throughout the Commission. Particularly, one of the major things that happened was that there's this thing called the FinGov, which is the Finance Committee within the Commission, and they have representatives from different regions. And in the Eastern European region, the region's meant to vote, and there was two candidates. One candidate was from, who was, Iulia, do you remember who the other candidate was from?
Latvia.
Yeah, so we had Latvia and Russia were the two candidates, and obviously the region couldn't come to an agreement because, you know, Ukraine is opposing, and rightfully so, opposing Russia. And basically Russia pulled out the rule book of the Commission and was pulling out all these rules that have never been enforced. So like they were pulling out right to reply, which has never been used. Usually they'll have an agenda item and everyone gets to say their piece and then we move on. And Russia was using right to reply to people's statements opposing the war in Russia. Russia obviously, of course, is refusing that this is a war, kept going on about their special operation. Ridiculous. But the major thing that happened that kind of halted all proceedings was that there's this election. They couldn't come to an agreement, so the Commission would have had to vote. Russia tried to delay the vote, which they then talked about delaying the vote, and then they had to vote about delaying the vote, which is all this very dramatic stuff. And at the end of the day, it meant that the agenda didn't, like, 2 whole days of the agenda, or maybe a day of the agenda, was delayed and didn't get addressed and the entire Commission was like running until 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And they just have these 5 days to make all the decisions. And yeah, so then once Russia lost the election, Russia basically made a statement where they directly called the Latvian representatives in the Latvian government Nazis, just straight out on the floor of the Commission, which is, you know, insane. Because I want to underline, like, we all know Russia says, like, their representatives say horrific things, but within the UN, and particularly within the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, we're talking about one of the highest levels of diplomacy. Like, the Commission is based on consensus, which is this, you know, they have to all agree, you know, they all have to sign off on a thing. They don't vote usually. There's only these very special circumstances where they vote. And, you know, you have to remain super diplomatic throughout this process. For consensus to work, people have to be nice to each other, because as soon as someone's unhappy, they'll block consensus. So, like, Russia calling people Nazis, and you know, the entire European Union walked out at that point alongside multiple other countries.
Rightfully so.
Rightfully so. I was on the floor watching it. Like, I was there, and it was insane. But it's not the first time Russia's called the Latvian government Nazis and all this sort of thing. But it was horrific. It was really terrible. And yeah, we saw in other areas, like, there was a major concern because all of the European Union countries had agreed to not engage with the Russian resolution. So Russia had a resolution. So outside of the scheduling, you have resolutions, which are written policies, and they have to pass by consensus. So everyone has to agree. And the way they do this is that they go and have these conversations. Some are closed doors, some are public, where they have these conversations amongst all of the countries who want to talk about it. And they all have to bargain with language. And then, you know, at the end, they say, we all agree to this. Basically, they all refuse to engage in conversations. So it never, you know, there was closed door conversations with, I think, 9 countries, like 9 of Russia's friends, and they all talked about the resolution, but it never made it to the public forum. It was never accepted. And we were really worried on the last day, because Russia's resolution was the third resolution. It was like L4 or something. So we still had 3 more resolutions afterwards. So if it didn't pass on the last day, everyone was sitting there like, is Russia going to pull its consensus from all of the other resolutions, and will there be no decisions at CND this year? And that was the nail-biting aspect. Like, were we going to see an entire CND where there was no policy development at all? And that was the really intense thing. Now, in the end, Russia agreed to withdraw their resolution. But they did that at the very last minute, like very, very last minute. And like we saw other resolutions being directly affected by Russia. So, for example, the Australian resolution was withdrawn. Now, like the reason for that is not confirmed, but like, you know, rumor has it that it was directly from Russia, you know, pushing to support the resolution. And as a result, Australia withdrew theirs, which is a really, really intense thing to do. You would only really withdraw a resolution if you didn't think it was going to pass, or you didn't think it was possible it was going to pass, or like if there's a good reason, right? Like if it wasn't relevant to the purpose of the commission or something like that. But like it was very intense to see this happen, and just to see almost every single forum within the commission directly affected by the conflict. And yeah, it was very intense, and you know, it was kind of the first time that we saw, you know, a lot of rule breaking on the floor. Like, you know, there's a lot of traditions within the diplomacy of like, you don't directly name people, and you don't directly name governments most of the time, and you don't directly name wars. Like, it's like kind of the generalized attitude. And this is like a time where we saw, like, from the start, from the opening statements, you know, direct addresses to the Russian government, direct addresses to the to like, you know, directly supporting Ukraine and naming people by name, which was like very intense. And the other thing that was maybe a little bit in like, you know, that the drug policy folks were talking about was the fact that there has been this conflict has affected people who use drugs majorly in Ukraine. You know, we're talking about very limited access to any type of harm reduction service, limited access to clean needles, limited access to opioid agonist therapies, so, you know, buprenorphine and all this sort of thing. You know, where there's people suffering. And of course, when you have to like close your borders, put armed troops all over your country, we're talking about limited access to drugs, which is always a really severe issue, because when there's less drugs in a country, the more polluted the supply becomes. And the more desperate people will have to become in order to access their drugs. And that was like a really severe thing, but was barely mentioned by any of the countries. Which I thought, you know, if you're at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, like, why not attack Russia for doing this to Ukraine and affecting, you know, the drug using populations and possibly causing all these secondary deaths and, you know, humanitarian, like, it's part of the humanitarian crisis that happens within a country during conflict. But no, it was more of just an opportunity to exercise political power, which, you know, isn't surprising, but I, you know, expected a little bit more of the progressive countries, at least the countries that support people who use drugs. And it was sad to see them just kind of harp on the general, you know, they could have, this was an opportunity for them to stand up for people who use drugs.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, the sort of direct sort of connection to drugs was actually, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, was made by Russia as part of sort of their rhetoric that somehow the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people in general are both traffickers and addicts. So it was a very weird discourse, and there wasn't a lot of opposition or a lot of direct call out of those discourses, although they were very harmful. And
what I will add is that when the Latvian representative won the election, and in her statement, she brought up Russia's like basically breaching of human rights of people who use drugs directly. And I would highly recommend, if anyone wants to read that statement, to look up the CND blog. We'll probably link it in the show notes somewhere or something like that. But that statement is one of the strongest statements I have ever heard at the CND. bar my own. And it was really, really good. And I would highly recommend giving it a read, because it's a very kind of symbolic of how the Latvian-Russian relationships have developed, and how the kind of corner that Russia's put Latvia in many different circumstances.
Wow, incredible. And Iulia, you also made a statement to the CND, right?
Yes, I did.
Cool. How was it?
Well, it wasn't as exciting as a lot of the other things that happened this year at the CND. I think this year's CND has been definitely historic in many ways, in the ways it broke consensus and in the ways it kind of directly attacked Russia for the atrocities that they're perpetuating there in Ukraine. But what we've sort of tried to do at the CND as a youth-led organization is very much influencing the kind of space that we have in order to really drive policy change. So I had a statement really sort of criticizing some of the shortcomings that the UN has not been addressing so far, particularly in relation to the Youth Forum and their selection process, and how a lot of the youth-led organizations have not been able to access that space. And that space very much has been kept, as Róisín said before, separate from main CND proceedings. So a lot of our direct advocacy strategy at the UN, including my statement, was sort of focused towards really promoting meaningful youth engagement and really drawing attention to how a lot of the mechanisms that are in place need to be reformed, and that other mechanisms also need to be put in place. We tried very much to encourage country delegations to include young people in their structure and actively promote them in negotiations, and really very much trying to pinpoint that young people have agency, and they need to be treated as stakeholders in their own right, rather than just people that are exposed or are given benefits by adults, or are taken benefits by adults. So I think it was very much trying to draw attention to the fact that young people are stakeholders in themselves and need to be treated as such in these spaces.
Incredible. And so let's hear a part of your statement now.
Here is a member of Paradigma, a global coalition of youth-led organizations that works to uplift the voices of young people at the United Nations. In the UNGA's 2016 outcome document and the 2019 Ministerial Declaration, the international community has made key commitments to ensure active and meaningful participation of youth and youth-related organizations in the development, implementation, and evaluation of drug policies and programs. We would especially like to commend UNODC for its efforts with the Youth Forum and the Listen First program. But, as we have previously highlighted in this space and others, multiple country delegations and civil society organizations have unsuccessfully attempted to gain clarity on the function, selection process, and methodology of the Youth Forum, which we find concerning. We ask the UNODC to publicly outline the methods in which it engages young people and youth-related organizations in the development and implementations of drug policy and programs, particularly in their relation to the Youth Forum. Alongside this, we ask UNODC to allow youth organizations to engage with the Youth Forum and facilitate this process. Similarly, we ask that the Youth Forum and its representatives are provided with the opportunity to engage with the proceedings of the CND through observing the COW and speaking at the plenary to provide contributions to various agenda items. While we're happy to see youth welfare featuring so prominently in resolutions and the speeches of member states, we stress the need for active youth participation and input in the development of policies that directly affect them. We urge member states to ensure that all policies and programs are developed in consultation with youth and youth-led organizations, both nationally and here at the CND. We also ask member states to lead by example, actively including youth representatives in their delegations and all other drug policy development fora.
It is in this way that we, as an international community, can truly pride ourselves with the efforts made to maximize youth welfare, with and alongside the youth people that hold our future. The challenges we collectively face today in the drug policy realm cannot be addressed in an effective and sustainable way without bringing youth to the forefront of international and national policymaking mechanisms. We cannot create a better, safer society for young people whilst leaving their voices behind. And for this reason, we also urge the international community to look closely at the situation in Ukraine and take all the necessary measures to safeguard the children and adolescents, particularly those who use drugs and are currently affected by drugs, that have now suffered due to an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And now for the International Harm Reduction Association, Ms. Larasati, in an online statement. You have the floor.
Wow, that was great. Awesome. Thank you, Iulia. Thanks for speaking up for the youth of the world. And so just like, I really want to know, how did you like feel when you were doing this intervention?
I definitely think it was a mix of feelings. There was a lot of nervousness, which kind of stemmed from sort of the technical difficulties of having to navigate a statement at the UN online and sort of learning the platform. Oh, yeah. Just making sure that people hear you and that people don't wait for you too long. But I think it was emotional in some sense, especially at the end where we very much tried to draw attention to what was happening in Ukraine. I think for me, it turned out very emotional, and I'm sort of glad that I didn't say more, because I would have probably cried by the end, because as an Eastern European, sort of, you know, not necessarily being directly affected as Ukrainian people are by what is happening there, but sort of, you know, being forced to live with that reality on a day-to-day basis, and having parents that are scared, you know, and that, you know, are crying because of what is happening there and don't know what their future holds, and sort of having the panic in the country with like radiation pills being made freely available and produced in a couple of weeks. And sort of just building on, you know, a history of trauma that sort of is existent in Eastern Europe when it comes to Russian aggression. I think that was a part of my speech that was hard to deliver. And I think both Róisín and I were sort of thinking a couple of days before, oh, what should we say about this in a way that also does not affect our members, because we have members in Eastern Europe, and we very much want to be careful of what we say and how we say it, because we know that, you know, not everyone lives in a place where they're free and where they're not persecuted for their beliefs. So we very much try to find a balance between conveying our message, being in line with everyone else in civil society that really was unified in sort of bringing attention to the situation in Ukraine, but also trying to protect our members and make sure that nobody has any sort of issues, because we decided to talk on what was happening in Ukraine. So I think that was my sort of my feelings related to the statement. I definitely think by the end I was so excited. I think I was with Róisín on the phone. We were like, oh my God, this was so amazing. I want to do this again. So it was definitely a mix. I was very happy to be able to speak there and advance the youth voice. And yeah, I really love that we managed to draw attention to the things that we value and that we advocate for in those spaces. But it was a bit of weight to what we said, and yeah, it was an issue of sort of balancing that.
All right, thank you so much for.
I was really proud of you, Iulia, when you did it. Like, you killed it, and it's a hard thing to do. Like, I also had to do my speech virtually the year before, and like, it's scary and it's nerve-wracking and you don't have the buzz of the building. And it was, yeah, I was really proud when you did it, and you know, you really represented us really well. And I think like your speech made an impact, and I think it was really strong. But it's always overwhelming when you see your team go out and do something like this, because it's such incredible experience. And like going to speak at the UN, like how many people do you know who's done that? You know, like it's pretty badass. And it's just really important that like young people like us get our chance to be there.
Yeah, and in many ways, it's a formative experience. And Iulia, thank you for bringing our attention and the UN's attention to this issue. Our thoughts and our prayers are with the people in Ukraine who are experiencing a tough time right now, and we all hope that it's going to end soon. And otherwise, thank you so much for being guests to this episode. I'm sure we'll see you soon again. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. We're so excited and just delighted to have a chance to chat about this.